Everybody, here we go. It is week 4, session 4. Today's focus is on cognitive load theory. Next slide, please. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that for those of us who are here in Delta, joining in on this Zoom, that we're meeting on the ancestral and traditional territories and lands of the Musqueam and Tsawwassen First Nations. I'd also like to just kind of point out that this image that we've been sharing the last few sessions is actually from here in Delta. It's from what used to be called Boundary Bay School over in Tsawwassen. And what you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there is 5 cedars. This is part of the Giving Tree project that's happening around our district right now, where the municipality or the city of Delta has donated a cedar tree to each school site. The underpinning idea really here, being about centering our local environment, and of course, cedar trees, which play all sorts of important roles, both in the present day and also historically, especially for members of our First Nations communities. Okay, so next one. So just a really quick recap. We're just going to talk through the first 3 sessions really quickly, and then we're going to give you an opportunity to really just connect and talk in small groups before we jump into the cognitive load piece. So in week 1, our big focus was really on talking both about the science of learning in general and also about how learning is really a change in long-term memory. As part of that conversation, Neil, feel free to click just one more. As part of that conversation, we talked about a model for learning that you can kind of see there on the top part of your screen. And we also talked about forgetting, both the inevitability of forgetting and the importance of forgetting. So in week 2, we really talked about the practical implications of what we had learned. And the practical implication was really exploring the promise of retrieval for learning. So just one more click there. And the big implication being there that we could really interrupt the forgetting curve by spacing out or interleaving our retrieval practice. Now in week 3, which was just last week, we talked quite a bit about how learning can be invisible, how it can be complex, and how it can be hard to judge, both for the learners themselves and also for teachers. It's not too much of an image, but yeah, there we go. Rose-colored glasses for especially our most novice learners who might be there might be a bit of a disconnect between what they think they ought to be working on and what's next versus what would help them. And also the set below, which kind of symbolizes the idea of, what are we looking for as teachers and how do we make sure that we're not confusing things like short-term or scaffolded performance with actual learning. So that's the 3 weeks just in a quick recap. And here's our activity. Yeah, so let's just take about 10 minutes, maybe just a little bit less. And actually just go ahead and click all the buttons there, Neil, sorry. There we go. Let's take 10 minutes in breakout rooms to just think about what we've kind of worked through these last 3 sessions and kind of just discuss and reflect. You have 2 choices here. One is a because, but, so sequence. And I think it's fairly straightforward. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, it is a writing routine that comes out of a book by Natalie Wexler called The Writing Revolution. So it essentially starts off like this. As a teacher, it's helpful to understand learning as a change in long-term memory because you would write out your reason or reflect on it. And then you do the same thing for the stem below, which looks at as a teacher, it's helpful to understand learning as a change in long-term memory, and as a teacher, it's helpful to understand learning as a change in long-term memory, so, which kind of speaks to the implications. Anyway, it's worth a dabble, I would say, if you hadn't had a chance to play with it. But that said, maybe you just want to talk and you don't want to feel so scaffolded, and that's that second option, right? Really, we're just asking you to take some time, reflect on your context with colleagues, think about the students you're working with, the curriculum they're learning. How do the insights that we've kind of discussed these last 3 sessions have relevance for you? What questions or wonders do you have? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Neil for breakout rooms. Any questions before we break out? we're essentially thinking groups of around 3, and really it's a chance to.
All right, so we're going to keep going on today's content, which is around cognitive load. This guy here, Dylan William, well-known educational voice, says that cognitive load is the single most important thing for teachers to know. So fairly big statement by Mr. William. And so we'll explore that over the next couple weeks. We're going to look at this over kind of 2 weeks, and it does influence a lot of different areas of learning. And we've already kind of covered some of these things, but we'll look a little bit today at what is cognitive load and talk about one model or kind of one version of cognitive load that has 2 components to it, intrinsic versus extraneous load. Next week, we're going to look at the implications of the difference between novices and experts. And that has some serious implications for problem solving and some of the ways we design learning. So that's what we'll talk about for the next couple of weeks. We have been coming back and forth to this model quite a bit, the Willingham model, which is, learning starts by paying attention to the environment. What we pay attention to is what we're conscious of is in the working memory. And we have this long-term memory that is what we can get in there is limitless in space. And one way I read this last week that was kind of interesting is that the environment is limitless and our long-term memory is limitless, but it's our working memory that is the bottleneck. It's the place where the problems happen. And so we think about, and I think this is what Dylan William is getting at, is that having an understanding of how working memory or short-term memory works as a bottleneck is super important for a whole bunch of ways that we design learning. And really crucial to that it's new information that takes up more working memory capacity than our familiar information. So we're going to go through a bunch of things around that today. So cognitive load is basically, we introduced in the first week, generally people can hold 5 to 7 things in their short-term memory, working memory, regardless of and they're all theories. They're all there is no working memory space in the brain. It's sort of a model. But when we think about cognitive load, it's the amount of resources or energy, or brain sort of energy that we are putting towards the tasks. And we only have a limited amount, okay? And basically, we're going to look at 2 different types of load that go in that fill up our short-term memory. We've got something called intrinsic load and extraneous load. Different models, you'll sometimes hear about other things if you go into the research, but those are the core ones we think are important to understand. And then whatever's left is the space that's available for thinking. So if our working memory is overloaded with too much intrinsic or too much extraneous, and there's no space left, then we have what's called an overloaded or cognitive load. Okay. And what happens if working memory is overloaded? You can imagine this trying to read something. And an example of this would be trying to read something that is really difficult to read. This was a piece of text. When I was doing my master's degree, I was taking a course on this German philosopher and Heidegger or Gadamer, and we had to read this text. It was the hardest thing I've ever read. And it was about 500 pages of text like this. I'll give you a second just to try to capture the sense of it. And I spent a whole course reading this one text, and I had no idea what it was about. I still cannot tell you what the text is about. It was the most frustrating reading experience I've ever had in my life. And I considered myself to be a fairly decent reader, okay? But what it is there's a whole bunch of things going on there when our working memory there is overloaded, okay? Learning is slowed down. It took me forever to read parts of it because I had to constantly think and stop and go back. And so the learning was very, very slow. Content, when our working memory is overloaded, the content being taught may be understood, misinterpreted, confused. We may pick up misconceptions. It's harder to encode the content into a long-term memory because we're spending so much time figuring out just what the heck is going on that we're not doing the processing that consolidates it into memory. And so there's just so much energy in the processing. And what that means then is students can actually confuse us as teachers because they can complete tasks or solve problems, but they don't actually develop conceptual understanding. And there's been lots of research on different math structures in particular, where different types of problems, students can actually solve the problems, but they're not developing the conceptual understanding that lets them transfer. And we're going to get into that a lot next week, this idea of the difficulty of transfer. It's been one of the perennial problems in education, is why do we learn things that appear to learn things in one place, but we can't transfer it to another? And a lot of it has to do with some of the things we're going to kind of lay the foundation for today. So we're going to start with intrinsic load. Okay, intrinsic load comes from the stuff that's being learned. Okay, I'm just going to put the chat up here. Make sure I'm not missing any questions. Intrinsic load is the actual material that's being learned. So it could be, we're learning about the water table or the water cycle, or we're learning about a historical event. It's the actual stuff, it might be a skill, and it's the complexity of the actual material that we want students to engage with itself has a load to it. Okay, and it's necessary because the students have to, our brains, as we talked about last few weeks, our brains have to process and make the connections in order for us to actually learn it. Good example from reading. We've been doing lots of work at the district level on reading research. And basically the act of learning to read in a very simple way is connecting the letters that we see with the sounds that they represent, with the sounds of the words that we know. And students have to go through this mapping, this kind of connecting called orthographic mapping, where the brain has to pull these pieces together. It has to know has to recognize the visuals, the sounds, and the meaning and put it together. And that's load, it's work. And if we rob students of actually doing that work, the intrinsic load of reading, of decoding words for the first time and building up word recognition, then they are not they're not going to be able to do the reading in the future. Okay, so intrinsic load is determined by the complexity of the material and the prior knowledge of the learner. If something is brand new, there's going to be a high level of intrinsic load if you know nothing. So when I'm reading that book of philosophy, there was so much in there I didn't understand, so many historical references that I didn't know. And so it was incredibly complex to me because every single reference and analogy took work for me to figure out. Someone else who knows that world well is the intrinsic load is going to be much lower because of all the prior knowledge that they bring. Unfamiliar content requires extra intrinsic load. So the more new information that we experience, the more intrinsic load there is. And so if we're overwhelming kids with a whole bunch of new stuff at the same time, then it's going to max out their intrinsic load. And we're going to get into this next week. What's difficult for a novice might be very easy for an expert. So even if you think of that learning to read, when we forget that when we're learning to read early days, other than those are kind of early teachers here, early learning teachers, that letters start out as just circles and lines and little scribbles, almost like, we've never learned Chinese or Japanese. Those symbols don't make any sense for us. And early learners have to figure out what letters are and how they build into words and how they build into phrases and how they build into sentences. And so our act of reading right now is drawing on an unbelievable amount of background knowledge for us to be able to read. And it's very hard for someone who's learning. And so that applies across every discipline. Things that are really hard at the beginning become easier for experts, common sense. Which means that, this is super important, that knowledge and skills that we can draw on fluently and automatically, they don't add to intrinsic load. Okay, so under reading again, well, here's some examples. So we all know, for example, once you've driven for a long time, the act of driving becomes automatic. And so we can easily drive along the road or the highway and listen to music. It's probably less, you're probably less able to do it if you're in a place that you're unfamiliar with, or if you're reversing the car. I always have to turn off the radio when I'm trying to back up or in a place that I don't know, because there's too much load. But if I'm just cruising along the highway and I'm doing so automatically, there's other things I can do. And so it's this balance of the things that are automatic to us and the things that are new, that max out our cognitive load. We've talked about how automatic word recognition is required for reading comprehension. If there's not enough fluency, comprehension doesn't happen, because there's so many mental, so much mental work going on to just decoding the text, the individual words, and not enough is left over to connect within the text or outside of the text. And so comprehension really suffers. Also in math, having fluent math facts frees up short-term memory so that students can do deeper mathematical thinking. If every time students have to really think about what is 2 + 3 or what is 5 × 6, then it slows down. Not only does it slow down their thinking, but it really impedes any higher level mathematical thinking. So that's where some of these things are just, there's some things that are super important for us to have fluent and automatic. Daniel Kahneman, who I've been reading a lot lately, kind of Nobel, I think I've mentioned it before, kind of a leading thinker in the world of how we think and how we make decisions. Has a statement in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow: anything that occupies our working memory reduces our ability to think. Remember, there's that little bit of space at the top. We have some intrinsic load. We're going to get to extraneous load, and whatever's left is what we think with. So we can try a little experiment here. Actually, you know what? We're going to skip through this because I don't want to waste too much time on this. But actually, I'll go back. Here's an example. This is where schema come in. So if I show you a bunch of letters like this and ask you to remember them, they're very difficult because there's actually there's no sense to them. There's 6 × 3, there's 18 letters there, which is beyond what our cognitive load. But if I shift those same letters just by 1, now you have CNN, PhD, FBI, CIA, NCA, AA. Those are 6 acronyms. So now, because we have the schema to tie those two, we would now only have to remember 6 things. Okay. So the more background knowledge that we bring, the more we can make sense of things and remember things more quickly. Okay. This applies to reading significantly, the background knowledge that we have and how that influences our ability to read. This is a famous study called the baseball study. It's been replicated many times. And basically, if you take groups of students and you give them a text to read and you split them into 4 categories. One of them is students who we would consider to be good readers and they have background knowledge on that subject. So this is on baseball. Kids who are good readers and they know baseball are on the left. So they have high comprehension. On the right, we have students who we would consider to have low reading ability and they don't know anything about baseball. So they have low reading ability, low background knowledge. They score the lowest on comprehension. But what's interesting is the middle group is that students with low, what we typically think is low reading ability, but high background knowledge actually outscore on comprehension students who have high reading ability, but low baseball knowledge. And so any measure of comprehension is often a measure of your background knowledge of that text, not just your measure of reading ability. And so all of these things kind of play into the load and our ability to comprehend. So we can reduce intrinsic load by doing a few things. And we want some intrinsic load, but we don't want too much. If we have too much, then we get overwhelmed. Teachers can reduce it by being explicit. First of all, explicit teaching, particularly for novices, particularly the earlier students are in a learning journey, the more being explicit research is overwhelmingly in favor of. So providing models and exemplars, being really clear with examples, teachers modeling their thinking out loud. If you're writing sentences for students, talking about what you're thinking about as you're writing, doing math, you're explaining the thinking and really guiding student attention to key points and critical ideas, helping direct them towards what most important in something you may be reading. We can also reduce it by reducing complexity, presenting new learning in small steps, really chunking, limiting the number of moving parts. So giving tasks that have so many pieces that it's asking too many things of students, particularly again, the earlier we are in the learning, the more novice we are. And it's not about age, it's about novice to expert. Breaking tasks into chunks and providing scaffolds for difficult tasks. So really trying to help students make sense of the content that we're trying to get them to. Building fluency is another one. So really thinking of how do we get students fluent in the things that we want them fluent in. Designing tasks that really do focus on building that fluency on one idea. Designing for schema building. So designing for conceptual understanding. We're going to talk about that a lot in week 6. And then also practice. Practice is another one of those words like memory, like knowledge that we don't talk about a lot, but the research is overwhelming that practice plays a key role in developing expert understanding in any area. And then also anticipating any barriers. So thinking about where might there be too much intrinsic load? Where might there be too many new words, too many new ideas? So a couple places that might help. One of them is the Rosenshine book. We've handed this out to a bunch of schools. It has so many practical ideas on different ways to provide examples and to model. The other is the Writing Revolution. Satnam mentioned this earlier. This is a very popular approach, a very structured approach to writing that really breaks things down into bite-sized chunks. What I like about it is it really connects writing with thinking. And so it recognizes that by teaching kids to write with thoughtful sentence stems, it actually helps them think about the content and unearth their thinking. So things like the because, but, so that we've used a bunch of times. Their belief is that elementary kids should only ever focus on writing sentences. That's it. Like if we can just get every elementary kid coming out with just very strong sentence writing skills, forget about paragraphs and essays, it would go a long way. So it breaks things down really, really small. The other one I just wanted to talk about just really quickly is a project that we've been doing from the district for the last 3-4 months. And it's called the Success with Short Texts project. And basically what we've done is for grades 4 to 7 teachers, we came up with this framework of how to help teachers help students access complex text. And it has 6 parts. And really quickly, there's 2 before reading sections, which is thinking about pre-teaching some vocabulary, language, structures, prior knowledge, thinking about any specific students that would require based on the diversity of your classroom, additional supports, listening to a text before, or reading it with somebody before. We have a whole bunch of routines that help students participate in reading structures, reading routines during reading. So everyone reads, reading a text multiple times, looking at some of the affordances or some of the complexities of the text, the intrinsic load of the text, you might think, the things that are in a text that make it difficult, but also provide learning. And then routines are ways to consolidate and kind of connect the text and also some of that retrieval practice. And so we've built these bundles of text, and each text has sort of determined routines. We've had 12 teachers go through it so far, piloting it, and a bunch of other ones kind of playing around with it. And I'll just give you a second here just to read a couple of the comments that teachers have been saying about the short text project. I'll give you a couple more here. Oops, I got 2 of the same ones on there. I must have really liked it. Sorry about that. Overall, it's been really, really positive so far in terms of the impact on student learning, student confidence, student engagement, focusing on their reading, but their teachers are commenting on impact on student writing. So it's been super, super encouraging to us so far that have been a part of it. That was all intrinsic. Let's talk about extraneous. So extraneous, second part of this, is stuff that is external to the whatever it is, the content being taught. So extraneous results from the manner and structure in which information is presented to students. Students should seek to minimize this. So intrinsic, we want to keep some. It's important to have some intrinsic, but not too much, but we want to kind of find a sweet spot for intrinsic. Extraneous, we want to try to really minimize as much as possible. Okay, the reading example, I talked about how the intrinsic was, we want kids to make the connections between letter shapes, letter names, letter sounds, and sort of the phonological awareness that they have of the words that they know, and sort of all those things kind of come together. I'm doing a horrible job of butchering reading. But what's interesting is teachers may be tempted when students are struggling to have them, in the past, we've encouraged looking to a picture, okay, a context clue. And when we look to a context clue, what that actually does is it's extraneous information. It may be intrinsic to the book, but to the meaning of the text, but it's extraneous to the act of orthographic mapping. So it's extra to the actual act of trying to connect the letter name, letter sound to the word meaning. And so it becomes something that actually takes away the intrinsic load to the point that students are bypassing it, and then we're robbing them from the chance of actually learning that word. Now it's subtle because sometimes we are more focused on having students understand the meaning of a text or a sentence. And so context clues are great. Looking at images or visuals will help us understand context. It will help us understand text. But then there are times when, if we're focusing on the act of getting better at decoding, then the images become extraneous. So it's really important to know what is the core learning that we want to be having students engaged in. Extraneous load comes from the environment. And so you can imagine an environment that's really noisy, that's really busy, would be distracting to your working memory. If you've got a phone that's buzzing all the time, if students are trying to work on a laptop and people are texting them and there's games going on, all of that stuff that surrounds the learners add extra load to the working memory. The classroom structures, so the routines, the culture in the room, the way conversations happen, the way you hand things out and take them in, and there's a whole bunch of things there that can add to the working load of students, the working memory. The way we design our tasks and assignments, if they're not clear, if they're not scaffolded, if they're not structured, if they have a whole bunch of fancy fonts that are hard to read, or there's too much visually going on, even on that stuff we hand out, can be distracting. All these things overwhelm the brain. The resources that we use, so even the layout of the books that we use, websites can add a whole bunch of extraneous load because every time you go there, there's stuff on the side that distracts you. Multimedia is a really interesting one because there's a whole bunch of different research that we won't get into on different types of media and how it can both add and take away from cognitive load. And important to remember that novice learners get more overloaded. And so the more extra stuff there is, the more likely that our novice learners are the ones that struggle. Okay, some examples. So this is some interesting research I came across this week. I like this term, seductive details. These two researchers for decades have looked at, Harp and Meyer have looked at all these different ways that additional information, so students who read or listen to passages with seductive details, interesting but irrelevant, recalled significantly fewer main ideas and generated significantly fewer transfer solutions. So if we're reading texts that have a lot of extra information, it becomes harder for students to find the main idea. And particularly the less you know about a topic, the more seduced you will be by extraneous information. This was interesting too. And again, one of those places where this kind of maybe pushes us a little bit. Additional information, details that teachers might add for emotional connection, they actually don't increase understanding. This, at least within the world of scientific concepts. And so sometimes teachers will tell stories or show pictures or add extra information to try to make an emotional connection. But what it often does is confuses students between the core messages of what the actual concept is. The more open-ended or less explicit a learning situation, the more it demands on working memory, and therefore less accumulation of knowledge. This is because short-term memory is being used to understand the problem or engage in relevant information rather than focusing on processing that information. So the more open-ended a project is, the more open-ended a learning experience is for students, the more it becomes difficult to process if we don't have the background knowledge. And so the core message here that I've really wrestled with over the years is that we're not saying that we don't do things like inquiry-based or project-based learning. But if we do them early on and we do them at a stage where the learners are too novice, it's going to be detrimental to student learning. The further we are along a learning journey, the more kind of conceptual understanding we have, the more likely we are to find success in more open-ended learning environments. So it's not about do they work or don't they work? It's about when they work and for who do they work, I think are the questions we need to ask. Is not do we do inquiry or do we do projects? The question is when and with who and what do they need in place to do those things successfully. This is kind of an interesting one. I'll skip it for now because as usual, we're running out of time. But it's a really interesting one that you'll have the slides after, you can look at it if you're interested. But basically, it's just PISA is the international exams that are written every 3 years with literally hundreds of thousands of students around the world. They get used to compare countries and all sorts of things. There was and then they get analyzed to death. And there was a research study done on PISA math, which was in 2015. And what it looked at was kind of math education around the world. And one of the things that came out of there, which is really interesting, was some complexity around real world math. And often when we often are asked or told that we want to make math real world and so that students can make connections to it. The challenge is it can actually be harmful because in many ways, because the brain, if you remember back to like week 1, how the context in which we learn something, the brain can get stuck there. And if we constantly make connections to real world situations, the students are never able to transfer those conceptual understandings out of that one context. And I remember having a conversation with somebody recently, even as a math teacher, said, like, I don't understand why my students can't add decimals as soon as we're not talking about money. If you put a dollar sign inside of something, these kids can add 25 cents plus 50 cents, no problem. As soon as you take it away, they can't do it. And it's because we've maybe relied too much on the real world context, and then their understanding is so tied to that context of money that they can't transfer it out of, they can't transfer the learning out of that. So extraneous load, how do we reduce it? We want to limit the distractions in the classroom. And I know many teachers work towards that, but really thinking about what's going on in the classroom. We want to make explanations and instructions concise, using as few words as possible. When using slides, there's a whole world of research on how we represent things visually. We want to use as few words as possible and use visuals. Satnam and I haven't always been great at that, sorry, on our slides. But this is a big one. Don't use words and text at the same time. And I know I've been guilty of it even today. But particularly when somebody puts up some text and then they're talking about something else, it's really hard for the brain to do one or the other. And so when you're presenting information, don't do that. And where possible, use diagrams, don't use photographs. This is an interesting one that came up a bunch in the research. Photographs have too much extraneous information and students can actually get pulled away. So whenever you want to explain something, diagrams are better than photographs. We want to help students withdraw their attention away from non-relevant details and really use experiential or real-world context carefully, because students are often drawn to the surface characteristics of those things and not the conceptual understanding underneath. So here's what we're going to do. We're a couple minutes past 4, so we're not too bad for time. What we want to do is I'm going to put in the chat a link to a document here that has a bunch of nice examples and non-examples that Satnam and I came across. And what we'll do is give you a few minutes to go through those. And then there's some questions for you, just a couple of non-examples. You can think about how those could be improved. And then what comes out of what kind of themes emerge for you out of the example. So let me just get this, I'll stop sharing. I'm going to put this in the chat, and this will only take a few minutes, and then we'll be out of here. I'll give you about 5 minutes to do this, and I promise we'll be out of here about before 10 after 4. So if you want to click on that link, and I'll give you about 5 minutes to read through the examples and non-examples. If you're in a room with some people and you want to talk about them, great. Are those working okay? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Make sure you can get that. Good. Thanks, Jenny.